Good evening. Have you ever wondered why some of history's brightest minds are celebrated, while others are buried in silence? Why is it that Thomas Edison's name shines in classrooms, while Nikola Tesla, arguably one of the greatest inventors who ever lived, was left to die alone in a hotel room, his papers seized, his legacy fractured? And here's a deeper question. What if Tesla's greatest secrets weren't just inventions of the future, but rediscoveries of the past? What if the Wardenclyffe Tower wasn't just a failed experiment in wireless energy, but the resurrection of a technology once wielded by an empire erased from history itself? Tartaria? Tonight, we're not just exploring Tesla's story. We're peeling back the layers of silence that surround him. We're following the thread that ties his visions to the forgotten harmonies of Tartarian engineering, the domes, the towers, the instruments of resonance. And we're asking the question no textbook dares to whisper. Was Nikola Tesla trying to bring back the world that Tartaria once knew? If mysteries like these keep you curious, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Future Lore, and turn on notifications so you never miss our explorations of forgotten empires and hidden truths. Now, settle in, dim the lights, let your thoughts drift into that half-world between dreaming and knowing. Because tonight, Nikola Tesla will take us not into the future, but back into the echoes of a world deliberately forgotten. This is the story. In the quiet hills of Smiljan, a boy was born who could hear what others could not. Nikola Tesla grew up surrounded by streams that spoke in murmurs, winds that howled like choirs, and stars that glittered as if they were signaling. To other children, nature was background noise. To Nikola, it was conversation. He would later tell of visions, sparks of light that filled his eyes, patterns that danced before him when no one else saw them. His mother, Georgina, thought him strange but blessed. His father feared he might lose himself in fantasies. But Nikola himself knew these visions were not illusions, they were memories. Not his memories, perhaps, but the Earth's. When he closed his eyes, he did not simply rest. He dreamed of machines, towers taller than any built in his village, domes that glowed with light without flame, bridges of humming steel that vibrated like strings of an instrument. The boy was too young to know the word Tartaria, but in his marrow, he felt it. He was not inventing, he was remembering. Electricity was not Tesla's discovery, it was his inheritance. He believed energy flowed invisibly, endlessly, like rivers beneath the skin of the world. But unlike others, he sensed it had once been harnessed, long ago. When he studied lightning, he did not see chaos, he saw design. He spoke of the earth as a conductor, of the sky as a vast battery, of towers as instruments tuned to release the hidden current. To his colleagues, these were eccentric metaphors. To Tesla, they were blueprints. And here lies the thread. Tartarian ruins scattered across Eurasia, onion domes shimmering with gold, towers shaped like tuning forks, star forts humming with geometry. Historians dismiss them as ornamental, defensive, or decorative. Tesla looked at them and saw a network. He saw Wardenclyffe Tower before he built it. Where others believed humanity crawled slowly from darkness into light, Tesla believed we had once walked in radiance, only to fall. His life's mission was not invention, but restoration. Wardenclyffe Tower, rising on Long Island, was Tesla's boldest act of memory. To newspapers, it was a gamble on wireless telegraphy. To financiers, it was a madman's folly. To Tesla, it was a resurrection. Constructed of steel and timber, capped with a massive copper dome, Wardenclyffe echoed the silhouette of the Tartarian towers Tesla had sketched in childhood visions. Beneath it ran shafts drilled into the earth, reaching groundwater and bedrock alike, because Tesla knew power did not only come from the sky, it came from the resonance between sky and soil. He called it free energy, a phrase so simple it terrified his backers. Free because it could not be owned. Free because it belonged to all. Free because it came from the earth itself, just as it had once in Tartaria. But the tower was more than an invention. It was an accusation. It said, "Someone before us built this. Someone new. And if we know again, the history you have written, the history of coal, oil, wires and profit, collapses. That could not be allowed." The tower rose slowly, like a memory clawing its way out of the earth. On Long Island's quiet shore, where the salt wind carried gull cries and the horizon stretched unbroken, Tesla's dream began to take shape in timber and steel. At first, it was nothing, just scaffolds, piles of lumber, coils of cable. But in his mind's eye, it was already finished, standing proud as any cathedral, humming like a voice that had been waiting centuries to be heard again. The locals called it strange, a giant mushroom, an electric folly. Newspapers mocked it, financiers doubted it. But to Tesla, Wardenclyffe Tower was no experiment. It was a resurrection. He walked the site at dawn, before the laborers arrived, the dew still on the grass. He would pause by the great circular foundation, staring at the iron bolts anchored into the ground, each one placed with more care than a jeweler setting a diamond. Beneath those bolts ran tunnels and shafts, burrowing into the bedrock, reaching down toward the veins of the earth itself. Workers thought it madness. Why dig so deep for a machine meant to speak with the sky? But Tesla knew. Energy flowed both ways. The sky charged the earth, and the earth sang back to the sky. To harness one, you must court both. He had seen it before, though he could never admit it aloud. Not here, not to these men who thought of power only as steam in a piston or coal in a furnace. He had seen towers like this in visions, great domes of copper gleaming on the steps, lattices of timber and bronze, whole cities designed as resonant instruments. He could not say the word Tartaria to them, but he knew its echo. The Wardenclyffe Tower was not his invention. It was his memory, finally given form. When the dome began to rise, Tesla felt the air change. He said nothing of it to the men, but he felt it in his bones. The pressure of atmosphere bending, the subtle hum in his skull when he walked beneath the wooden frame. Even unfinished, the tower remembered what it was meant to be. Birds circled it differently, their calls pitched against the great skeleton. Horses balked near the site, uneasy with a vibration no human ear could catch. Wardenclyffe was supposed to send messages across the Atlantic, bypassing the cumbersome wires stretched across the ocean floor. That was the story Tesla gave to J.P. Morgan, his reluctant patron. But in the quiet hours, Tesla scribbled other diagrams, spirals reaching down into aquifers, coils meant to resonate with the Schumann cavity of the planet itself. He called it free energy. Not free as in cheap, not free as in charity. Free because it could not be caged. It was the hum of the earth itself, waiting to be tapped. To Morgan, it was heresy. Power, to Morgan, was coal in a train, oil in a barrel, copper in a monopoly. Power must be owned, sold, rationed. Tesla's tower threatened not just profits, but the very logic of empire. For if every home could draw power from the air, who needed barons? If every lamp could glow without wires, who needed companies? If every nation could feed itself from the hidden currents of the world, who needed war? And deeper still, if the tower worked, it would prove that history had lied. It would prove that Tartaria had been real, that its domes and spires were not primitive ornaments, but resonant machines. Wardenclyffe was not just a tower. It was a confession waiting to happen. the confession that humanity had once known this and lost it. Or worse, had it taken from them. The first tests were subtle. Tesla and his assistants wound coils as tall as men, their copper veins gleaming in the lamplight. Sparks leapt when they pulsed the current, not the short, crackling flashes of laboratory toys, but long, tendrilled snakes of light that writhed across the walls. The assistants gasped. Tesla only nodded. "It remembers," he whispered, though no one knew what he meant. At night, alone, he stood at the base of the tower and pressed his palm to the wood. He could feel it, the same way he had felt storms as a child, the same way he had seen patterns of light dancing behind his eyes. The tower was not silent. It was tuning. It was waiting for its song. He thought of the Tartarian ruins described in old travelers' tales. Onion domes that shone like miniature suns, cathedrals that needed no candles, plazas where fountains danced without pumps. He thought of the maps with Tartaria's name sprawled across them, and of the silence that followed when the name vanished. What had been buried in mud? What had been silenced in fire? Wardenclyffe was his answer, his defiance, his resurrection of a truth the world had chosen to forget. But Morgan knew. He may not have understood the physics, but he understood the danger. Tesla had promised a wireless telegraph system. Now whispers reached him that Tesla was speaking of free energy, of power broadcast to all. Worse still, there were rumors that Tesla spoke of ancient civilizations, of knowledge suppressed, of the possibility that he was not inventing at all, but rediscovering. To a man like Morgan, this was intolerable. Money could be controlled, narratives could be controlled. But if Tesla proved that Tartaria had once existed, that its technology had been buried, then the entire edifice of modern empire would crack. The order came quietly. Funding stopped. Creditors circled. Tesla's name, once respected, became the butt of newspaper jokes. Mad scientist. Dreamer. Fool. Wardenclyffe was left unfinished, its dome rising like a fossil from the fields. In time, it would be torn down, its materials sold for scrap. But its memory lingered. For Tesla had felt it. Even half-built, the tower had remembered. And he had remembered with it. He kept the vision alive in his notebooks, page after page of spirals, coils, waves, towers. Notes scrawled in his restless hand. The earth is alive. Energy belongs to all. They erased it before. They will erase it again. He never wrote the word Tartaria, but the silence around it was deafening. To the world, Wardenclyffe was a failure. To Tesla, it was proof. Proof that the past was not as barren as they claimed. Proof that memory could be resurrected in steel and copper. Proof that silence was not absence, but suppression. And so he walked away from the wreckage, not defeated, but haunted. Because he knew what few dared to whisper. The tower was not destroyed because it failed. It was destroyed because it worked. And because it remembered. The newspapers called it the War of Currents. On one side, Thomas Edison, brash, practical, backed by financiers who loved his promise of profit. On the other, Nikola Tesla, quiet, eccentric, driven not by money, but by visions of light and resonance. Edison championed direct current, wires carrying power neighborhood by neighborhood, meter by meter. Tesla fought for alternating current, a system that could reach far, wide, and free. But beneath this public struggle lay a deeper war, one almost no one spoke of. Because Tesla's alternating current was not just a clever improvement, it was the first whisper of Tartaria returning. The currents in his dreams. Tesla never saw electricity as numbers on a page. He saw it as a river, pulsing, alive. In the silence of his laboratory, he would close his eyes and hear it. The hum of frequencies older than empires, the same vibration he had sensed as a child when storms swept across the Balkan hills. To him, alternating current was not an invention, it was a rediscovery. He knew that energy did not crawl in a straight line, obedient only when tamed. It oscillated, breathed, surged forward and back like lungs. He was certain the ancients had known this, that Tartarian towers and domes had pulsed with the same rhythm, spreading light and warmth without wires or fuel. Edison could not imagine it. He thought only of copper sold by the mile, meters ticking profit like clocks. To Edison, electricity was a commodity. To Tesla, it was communion. The shadow of Tartaria. Wardenclyffe had not yet risen, but already Tesla spoke of wireless power, of towers that could transmit energy through the earth itself. To the public, this sounded like fantasy. To Tesla, it sounded like memory. In quiet moments, he compared his blueprints to sketches of old structures. Onion domes in Moscow, star forts scattered across Europe, minarets whose proportions seemed tuned rather than decorative. He whispered to a friend once that these buildings were not styles, but machines. The friend laughed, assuming it was metaphor. Tesla did not correct him. The war of currents was not just about which system would power cities. It was about which story of history would survive. If Tesla won, the world would stumble closer to the truth. That energy had once been free, abundant, and shared. That Tartaria had lived, and its silence was deliberate. Third Edison's campaign, Edison fought dirty. He staged demonstrations electrocuting animals, with alternating current to terrify the public. He whispered to reporters that Tesla's visions were madness. He lobbied politicians, painting alternating current as dangerous, reckless, un-American. And yet, Tesla's system triumphed. The Niagara Falls power plant, his dream of harnessing the natural world itself, lit up cities, carrying alternating current for miles, proving beyond doubt that his vision worked. But victory was hollow. Because even as Tesla's current flowed, financiers and industrialists tightened their grip. Westinghouse, who had once supported him, renegotiated contracts to keep profits in hand. The system spread, but not Tesla's dream. The world embraced alternating current, but not free energy. The wires still bound power to the marketplace. Tesla had won the battle of currents, but lost the war for the soul of electricity. 4. The suppression begins. Behind closed doors, whispers grew. Tesla spoke too often of towers that could power homes without wires, of machines that could heal the air, of energy that came not from burning, but from resonance. Investors frowned. Politicians grew nervous. Newspapers, once dazzled by his genius, turned mocking. And in the silence between headlines, the real war began. Tesla was not fighting Edison anymore. He was fighting the empire of forgetting, the same empire that had buried Tartaria. To admit Tesla's truth was to admit Tartaria's. To admit Tartaria was to admit history was not what we had been told. That knowledge had been erased before and could be erased again. Echoes of a forgotten empire. Imagine for a moment a different outcome. Imagine Tesla not as the eccentric genius sidelined by financiers, but as the heir to a legacy older than nations. Imagine Wardenclyffe Towers rising in every city, drawing power from the earth itself, lighting streets without wires, warming homes without smoke. Imagine oil barons, coal magnates, and bankers watching their empires collapse as humanity stepped back into harmony with the currents of the earth. That was Tesla's dream. And that was why he had to be silenced. The war of currents was never about AC or DC. That was the distraction, the show for the papers. The real war was about whether Tartaria would remain buried or whether its hum would rise again through Tesla's hands. Tesla had won the current, but Tartaria had lost the century. The tower rose like an idea the world had tried very hard to forget. At first, there was only the ring of driven stakes and the chalky sting of lime dust, men with rough hands squinting into a wind off the Atlantic. Long Island smelled of salt and cedar, and in the early hours the gulls wheeled like commas in a sentence not yet finished. The foreman shouted the measurements, hammers answered in a metallic chorus, and in the midst of it all, a tall, spare figure in a dark coat walked a slow circle, as if measuring not feet but breath, listening with his head tilted, his palms sometimes hovering in the air, as though feeling for temperature that wasn't there. "Here," he said once, and placed his heel into the ground, as if signing a document. No one saw the signature but him. "Here," he repeated, softer, almost to the soil. Then he exhaled, the way a singer does before the note. When they dug the first shaft, a hard pan of glacial till rang under the shovels. The men cursed. The clay fought them like a stubborn animal. But when the pick broke through and a vein of wetter sand collapsed with a sigh, the tall man, Tesla, put a hand on the scaffold and shut his eyes. The earth poured a cool smell up into the air. Iron, rain, a taste of stone like a memory on the tongue. He nodded once, as if someone besides him had given permission. He did not say, "I have walked here in dreams." He did not sketch the towers he had seen when he was a boy, and storms rattled his window, towers with copper crowns and latticed ribs that drank lightning like wine and answered thunder with a note so low you felt it in your teeth. He did not say the word he had learned much later in his reading, the word that felt less like a label than the last page of a letter that had taken 2 centuries to arrive. Tartaria. He would not speak it aloud here. Words have a way of attracting enemies, and this was a work that required listening more than speaking. The pit deepened. They shored it with plank and beam, drove iron like roots. Tesla would walk to its lip at dawn, when the mist still lay in threads over the grass, and the world had not yet begun to pretend it was anything but the planet's breathing. He would lift both hands, as if he were warming them at a fire only he could see. "Good morning," he whispered once. To what? The crew laughed about that. To the hole? To the wind? To the brass-headed bolts stacked like small cannons near the frame? He heard the laughter and did not object. Humor kept men in rhythm, almost as well as music. Rhythm mattered. Nails set out of tempo can sour a building. The same way a note struck slightly false can sour a song. Every day he listened for slippage, not in plans. Plans were obedient, but in pulse. The frame rose in sections, triangles within triangles, a woven geometry the carpenters understood the way a fisherman understands nets. It looked light, almost playful, until you tried to shift a single brace and found the whole thing answering with a refusal. "It's like a whalebone cage," one man said, lightly touching his cap to the lattice. Tesla smiled. Good. Bone implied a body. Body implied a life that could be quickened. He had been told, at every step, to soothe the financiers with small words. Wireless telegraphy, they liked. It tasted like profit. It tasted like ships whispering across oceans, without laying copper on the sea floor, like messages safe from storm and sabotage, like owning the conversation in every port. He could say the phrase without choking on it, because it was not untrue. The tower would speak, but speech was the least of what it could do. He had drawn other diagrams that nobody saw, spirals that were not decoration, domes cross-hatched like the interior of bells, columns that widened at their crowns like chalices catching an invisible rain. He never wrote free energy in a letter to the men who wore velvet and owned railroads. He wrote it to himself in the corners of notebooks, as if admitting a secret back to its origin. Free did not mean cheap. Free did not mean lawless. Free meant unowned. in the way the sunrise is unowned. Free meant available to the degree one learned to keep time with it, to the degree one learned the manners of a guest. The dome was lifted slowly, a copper hemisphere with ribs like the inside of a fruit. Clouds dragged their shadows over the meadow. The riggers cursed in languages that tasted of ports and wars. When the crown settled, and the last pin slid home with a sound like a deep, agreeing syllable, the men cheered. Tesla did not. He leaned against the post with both hands and listened. It was not silence, it was a pressure. The air thickened by a hair's breadth, and the little hairs on the back of his wrist stood up in greeting. The gulls altered their circles. The wind's edge blunted, as if pushed through a sieve of wires too fine for the eye. Someone near him swore softly, and didn't know why. He did. Even unpowered, the instrument was present. A violin hanging on a wall hums when a piano note matches its string. So too a structure will admit its favor or offense. The tower admitted, with a shy, anticipatory pleasure, that it was the right shape to receive a world. "Sir?" the foreman asked, puzzled, seeing nothing but a man who'd forgotten to breathe. Tesla inhaled and remembered to be ordinary. "Bolt the east struts," he said. "The sea will lean on them first." Newsmen arrived with notebooks and discussed. They were always handsome in their way, the ones who had learned to live by their pens. Clean boots, quick eyes, a laugh they could aim like a weapon. They pointed at the copper, and at the shaft doors that led underground, and at the coil house whose windows were blinded with paste, so that no one could see the great helical shapes sleeping inside. "Mushroom," they wrote, "wizard's toadstool." They sketched him with a cape he had never worn, holding lightning by the tail like a child's kite. He had learned to let the lies pass like weather. He could not, however, ignore a different weather, the damp shade cast by a name that arrived on heavy paper and did not laugh. Morgan. When the money troubadours from that mansion spoke, they did so in the declarative mood. "Telegraphy," they had said, tapping the edge of their cups to punctuate, "is the game. Not charity, not fantasies, telegraphy." He could have told them that telegraphy was merely a small name for a larger coordination, that the planet is a cavity resonator, and the air rings like glass if you learn the true pitch. He could have told them that domes and minarets and the onion crowns of old cathedrals were not merely a fashion, but the fossilized hints of an instrument set. That the star-shaped forts, which Europe had pretended were only defensive geometry, had in fact been arranged on lines that matched magnetic quirks in stone. He could have mentioned that certain bell towers, if you climb them at dusk, still speak to one another across districts in a language without vowels, and that old women in those quarters shut their shutters not because of superstition, but because the air is busier then, and you must be polite. He said none of this. Explanation was a currency that, in the wrong marketplace, buys contempt. Instead, he said, with as much humility as he could put into his mouth, "Yes. Telegraphy." And then he did what he had always done, build something that used the smallest acceptable word for the largest necessary truth. The coil house was where the hours turned strange. Inside, the smell of resin and heated varnish, braided with the metallic tang of ozone. Copper wound on copper, a geometry so patient it became gorgeous. Assistants in canvas aprons worked with long-fingered care, and the simplest task, tightening a binding here, sanding a burr from a contact there, took on the ceremonial dignity of sharpening a knife your grandfather had used to cut bread during his war. When they pulsed the first coil, the room did not explode into circus drama. It exhaled. The light seemed to lose weight and hang differently around the faces. The notes in the wooden bones of the building rose half a step. One boy laughed, then clapped a hand over his mouth, as if laughter were a faux pas in church. Tesla moved among the instruments with a courtesy he saved for very few people. He touched the binding posts with 2 fingers as if greeting an old acquaintance. He roughly adjusted nothing. He held his breath when he had to. He listened. Always he listened. Again, he would say, "Please." They would wind, pulse, measure. Once, in the midst of it, he pressed his knuckles to his sternum as if something there had answered a call. He did not explain. The first bolt from the dome was not a storm rod crack that would have satisfied the cartoonists. It was a filament, a vein of pale fire knitting air to metal. It made a sound like cloth torn slowly, like breath freed after being held too long. The assistants whooped, but their voices sounded far away, as if the room had grown larger while no one was looking. Tesla stood very still. The arc was modest, the meaning was not. When they powered down, the sudden absence was like a dropped hand. At night, he walked the perimeter where the meadow gave way to scrub and small pines. The Atlantic, somewhere beyond the low dunes, heaved its chest. He could not see it. He could smell it and feel it. He thought of another shore, of rivers he had never crossed, but knew in his bones from a map older than paper. Rivers whose banks held towers with copper faces turned to moons that have not visited this latitude in centuries. He thought of bazaars under vaults that sang, of bells that cooled the air around them, of streets aligned to winds like sails. He could hear it sometimes, the not quite silence of a city tuned to itself. Not memory, not invention. A third thing, a chord returning to a body. There were letters now, less polite each week. Scope, one of Morgan's men wrote, meaning, reduce yours. Deliverables, meaning, make your miracle smaller so it fits in a ledger. The word monopoly lay under their sentences like the iron under these fields. He looked at those letters and wondered what it must be like to spend your life in a house where everything that entered through the door was yours by law. Every broom, every confession, every child's fever. He could not live there. He did not hate those who could. He only knew that certain men become ill when the world refuses to behave like property. The ridicule campaign sharpened. It always does when money is embarrassed. A trained elephant in a circus was electrocuted with alternating current and filmed, a grotesque theatre billed as science. Pamphlets warned that the city's children would be swept from their beds by invisible tides. He read those stories with the peculiar feeling of watching a man slap at the wind with a board. The wind did not argue back. It only went on being the wind. He went back to the coil house. In the afternoons, when the sun sloped and the shadow of the tower fell across the grasses like a dial, he permitted himself a single superstition. He placed his palm against one of the lower braces and counted. Not seconds. The tiny tremors in the wood. Though there was no power moving then, the tree ghost inside the beam remembered storms, remembered roots, remembered the pull of the earth on sap. He had learned as a child that memory is not only an arrangement of thoughts, it is an arrangement of matter. A bell remembers the foundry. Water remembers the shape of the stone it passed 1,000 times. A city, if you keep your ear to it, remembers the steps of the people who loved it enough to lay its streets along a wind. Why would a tower not remember the future it had been pulled from? Men began to leave. Pay came late. Lumber arrived thin, warped. The small things failed in bunches, as small things do when something larger has decided itself against you. He kept accounts with the accuracy of a penitent, and found that accuracy did not attract money any more than prayer does weather. There were days when the supplies came because a clerk liked him, and not because a contract said they must. He thanked the clerk, and the clerk said, "My wife's headaches stopped the week you raised that dome." "I don't know why. That's none of my business." Tesla nodded. He would not say, Air can be taught to hold less thirst. Sound can be taught to carry less teeth. He would not say, "The tower is already working in the smallest ways," the way a dormant organ begins to breathe when the surgeon lays fingers on it. Morgan's emissary came himself only once. His shoes found no mud. Such men do not do mud. He stood where the shadow fell and squinted up as if the copper owed him a bow. "The Atlantic," he announced, as if that word carried its own guarantee, "is where value lies. We want messages, not theology." Tesla looked at the sea he could not see. "Messages," he agreed, "and the thing that comes before messages. Meaning?" "Connection," Tesla said gently. "A field in which a message is only a small act. The ether, not of ghosts," he added, because the man's lips tightened as if preparing to laugh, "but of relations. We bathe in it." The emissary smiled a smile that had drawn blood before. "I bathe in fresh water in my house," he said, "which is heated by coal whose price I control." Then, after a pause, "You will deliver telegraphy." "And more." "No," the emissary said. "Less." He went away. He took money with him that did not look like money until it failed to arrive. The next shipment of timber came with a note, payment on receipt. The bank in town grew tenderly formal. The newspapers frothed a little. When he read a column that called the dome a copper bubble inflated by foreign fancy, he laughed, not because it was funny, but because the writer had accidentally told a small truth. Yes, a bubble. An intentional one. A cavity that allows resonance to take shape. If you cannot honor a thing, at least name it correctly. There were nights when fatigue visited with knives. He lay in a cot in the office and watched the ceilings grain, run like currents in a river. Sleep did not come. Memory did. The room filled with a light that had nothing to do with lamps. He could smell old stone warmed by a sun that was not this one. He could hear a bell so large its first overtone was almost a taste, a copper sweetness under the tongue. He could feel, with the animal part of his bones, that he was in a city that did not fight itself. The air there was fractionally thicker, pleasantly so. Children ran and did not fall as often, because corners were curved where corners need to be curved, and windows did not glare, and floors did not bully knees. You could sit, in that place that was not here, on the edge of a fountain, and understand suddenly why the word public had once meant ours instead of no one's. When morning untied the dream and let it drift back into its country, he wrote in his notebook without turning a page to find a fresh one. Between calculations for coils he scrawled, "Not invention, continuation." Later, when he searched for that sentence, he could not find it. Perhaps he had written it in sleep. Perhaps the page had been taken by the same currents that now tugged at his money, his patience, his name. The first failure was ridiculous. A shipping clerk delivered cases of bolts, half a size too small, and refused to take them back because the invoice printed called for that size. The second failure was humiliating. A promised article in a magazine turned into a caricature with his head pasted onto the body of a carnival charlatan, offering bottled lightning to rubes. The third was the largest, a letter with a seal that meant courts, advising him that a lien had been placed on the property pending satisfaction of loans from men whose faces he could not bring to mind, though their names sat like pikes along the road to anyone's future. There is a fatigue that stops the hands. There is another that sharpens them. He found the second. He sold patents. He shaved promises down to their bones and balanced them like knives across the gorge. He kept the coil house alive and the dome whispering. He fired no one he did not have to fire. He learned the names of the wives of the men who stayed and the ages of their children. Not because he was kind, though he preferred kindness when possible, but because an instrument must know the names of its players to stay in tune. The weather turned. Autumn's first teeth pressed lightly at dusk. The tower creaked differently. a winter register just beginning to speak. A flock of starlings poured itself over the site and settled on the ribs like a dark garment. On that day, for the first time, he permitted himself the thought that the tower would end as a skeleton. He permitted the thought the way one permits a persistent guest a cup of tea in the kitchen. He did not invite it to sit in the parlor. He walked to the shaft doors and touched the iron. The wood was damp there, and the damp smelled clean, a deep mineral smell like the inside of a well. He spoke, very soft, in the language his mother had used when she taught him to listen for the time to harvest, a tongue round and grave as a bell. He was not asking for a miracle. He was greeting a neighbor. When he finished, he believed he heard, a tiny change in the long, low note the ground had been holding all summer. A consent. He smiled again. He was ridiculous when he smiled that way, people said. Too young for a face already so narrow. He could not help it. The body will make the shape it needs to make when it hears a yes. What he did not hear at first was the slow rustle of men gathering in rooms to decide the fate of things they could not have built if they had wanted to. He did not hear the pens drag through lines of figures that reduced his months to a number and then, with a neat strike of ink, to 0. He did not hear the newsroom laugh that follows a joke about a man who has become a brand, that odd halfway man who can be taken apart into adjectives and sold. He did not hear the clerk in the city bank say to a friend at lunch, "He's finished," with the relief of someone who enjoys the end of a long story, even if the story belongs to another man's house. He heard instead a new sound in the coil house, a deeper consonant among the vowels, a slow untying. He looked up from the instrument and caught sight of his face in the dark glass of the window. He looked older than yesterday, not ill, weathered. He put a hand to his temple and felt a small pulse under the skin like a bird insisting on being let out. "Another," he told the assistant. The assistant nodded and brought the switch. They pulsed the coil a fraction longer, a fraction lower. The arc walked out along the air in a line that had not been there before, a pale blue vein that found a hook and held there. The hairs on his forearm rose. The floorboards murmured. Somewhere outside, a horse stamped and then sighed as if relieved. He could feel, with the part of him that had once watched lightning through a cracked window, that the instrument had found a seam in the world and slipped along it. "Stop," he said softly, not in fear, in awe. The young man at the switch obeyed, and then turned to him, eyes bright with the kind of hunger that will ruin or redeem a life. "Sir?" He could not translate the feeling into a sentence that would not sound insane in that room. He could say, "It remembers." He could say, "This is not new." He could say, "I have been here before, and we are, somehow, late." He did not. He put his hand on the young man's shoulder instead and said, in the tone one uses for rights, "You did well." There is a moment in any work when the center of gravity moves from hope to proof. He felt it then. Proof did not pay debts. Proof did not stop men from pulling down what frightened them. But proof is a weather of its own. It thickened the air in his lungs and gave his spine another inch of height. The tower, this ridiculous, mocked, hunger-bitten thing, was now a fact not because an instrument had measured it, but because something in the city that was not yet built had turned its face toward him and recognized an ancestor. The next morning, a sheriff's man pinned a notice to the fence. He was polite, the way men are polite when they have jobs that require them to bruise strangers. He kept his hat in his hands. "Dr. Tesla," he said, getting the title wrong but meaning kindness by it. "There are proceedings." Tesla read the paper. The words were less important than the intention they carried. Power seeks its own echo. When it does not find it, it makes a noise like law. He folded the notice neatly and handed it back. "Thank you," he said. The man blinked. unsure whether he had been mocked. He had not. Tesla had thanked him for bringing the weather on time. He returned to the tower and walked the circle. A boy, one of the workers' sons, curious and brave in the way boys are, followed at a distance, and then, when Tesla turned and smiled, came closer. The boy's boots were too big. "Sir," the boy asked, "does it make lightning?" "It makes listening," Tesla said. "Lightning is sometimes what listening looks like. Will it make my mother not have headaches?" He did not laugh. "If it is allowed to do what it is meant to do," he said, "you will grow up in a place where mothers have fewer headaches. Yes." "Who won't allow it?" the boy asked, because children assume the world is made of people who can be named. "Men who have headaches of another kind," Tesla said, and touched the boy's hair, a gesture he did not allow himself often. "Run along." When the boy was gone, he stood very still and watched a long ribbon of cloud unroll over the sea. To anyone else it was only weather. To him, it was a sentence in a language he had been learning since he first held his breath to hear the shape of a room. The clause meant, "Hurry." The clause also meant, "Wait." Language is generous that way, the way rivers are generous, carrying two meanings at once if you can keep your feet. He did not tear anything down. He did not stand on a crate and shout. He did not write one more letter to a man who had already decided to make a cathedral out of a ledger book. He did what a musician does when the hall is taken away the night before the concert. He tuned the instrument anyway, because an instrument once tuned is harder to break without the breaker learning the sound of his own barbarity. When the men came with tools to unbuild the thing they had never been capable of building, he was not there. He had gone to the coil house, and then, when the coil house could no longer be justified to an accountant who had never once put his ear to wood, to a smaller room where the only moving part was his hand. He wrote, not treatises, not pleadings, drawings that did not look like the sort that convince bankers, spirals that caught at the eye and made it walk around them again and again until the movement itself taught something. Notes in margins that looked like prayers and were not. Figures that summed to a number and then, with a tiny correction of a pencil point, to silence. When the dome finally fell, when the instrument, unplayed, was made into scrap by men who would later drink the money down and never once sleep worse for it, the sound was wrong. He covered his ears and could still hear it. The copper, torn from its seat, cried. Not loud. He had expected loud. It made a sound like a woman who has decided not to speak. There are ruins that shame their makers, and there are ruins that shame their destroyers. He would have preferred the second. He did not get it. To shame, one must be watched by a conscience trained to blush. The men who sold the metal did not blush. The men who bought it smiled. The wind moved through the ribs that were left and made a private music he could not bear to hear. He left, not because he had stopped believing, but because belief had moved its address. The tower was no longer a thing on a field. It was a room in his chest where the air was tuned and waiting. He carried it with him to hotel rooms and small rented laboratories, and to benches where he sat and fed pigeons, who recognized, with more honor than some men, that he was a creature who listened before he took. In the nights that followed, he dreamed less of lightning and more of water. He dreamed of cisterns under cities, their brick arches damp with coolth, their surfaces dark and glassy, and full of the reflections of faces that had never once worried about whether their lamp would burn when the lamp wanted to burn. He dreamed of girls with their hair braided ringing bells, by pulling ropes whose fibers remembered the oils in the hands of their grandmothers. He dreamed of a hospital where the windows were placed at heights that taught illness to leave. When he woke, he would sometimes speak into the air, a handful of words in the old language that had grown in his mouth before English tried to own it. He said, "Thank you." He said, "Forgive me." He said, "I am still listening." He said, "I will not let them tell me that what I know is not known." In a city that will always love its noise more than its truths, men in good hats said he had failed. A newspaper said he had been broken by hubris. Another said he had been starved by genius. Bankers said nothing at all, which is the cruelest sentence some men can write. He walked among them like a man carrying a bowl of water across a floor where children had just learned to skate, carefully, with humor, refusing to spill even when bumped. At times he wanted to shout that the tower had worked, that even half-born it had seduced the air into confession, that even muzzled it had eased the headaches of a clerk's wife and made a horse breathe better on hot days, that it had proved a theory not because it threw a spear of light high enough to impress a cartoonist, but because it had done what all true instruments do, made the world more itself. But he also knew the rule that old cities keep written in stone somewhere the rain can't find it. Do not argue with men who are paid never to listen. He argued with time instead. He laid a finger on the page of a book and moved it from left to right, the way one does when one is teaching a child to read. He drew the coil again, and then made the line not a line but a path, and then made the path not a path but a river, and somewhere in that transformation, the sorrow decreased. The question, why was the project truly shut down, never left him. It walked beside him like a dog that loves you enough to nip your calf when you stray from the road. It wasn't about money, not ultimately. Money is merely how fear translates itself for men who have forgotten other languages. It was about the thing the tower threatened to make undeniable, that power, rightly understood, is not the art of owning, but the art of tuning, that a civilization could choose to be consonant with the earth, and therefore difficult to rule. That scarcity is often choreography, not fact, that somewhere beneath the mud and the burnt archives, there had been a network of towers and domes and star-shaped courts that made the ground hum, and that the name people once gave to the place that had known how to do that had been erased, because names can be erased more quickly than habits. He would never put Tartaria in a headline. He would not graffiti it on a wall. He would do what men who know the weight of a note do. He would keep humming it until other voices, unbidden, found the pitch. In the end there was no end, only the quiet fact of a man in a room drawing circles and sleeping lightly, listening for a bell miles away that should have rung but did not, listening for a tower in a field that had been reduced to silence, but would not, in a certain pressure in the ear, stop singing. And when he finally closed his eyes for the last time, in a bed that had been made by someone who did not know he had once tried to persuade the planet to breathe more kindly, there was a span of seconds in which the air over Long Island altered almost imperceptibly. A gull shifted course for no reason an ornithologist could publish. A woman whose headaches had returned put down her cup and said, to the quiet kitchen, "Ah, a boy in the city, no longer a boy," paused under a street lamp that hummed in a key he could not name, and remembered a tall man telling him that lightning is sometimes what listening looks like. The field where the tower had stood was ordinary again, the way a face after grief is ordinary only to strangers. Grass grew, people forgot to point as they passed. But sometimes, on days when the wind came from the south and the clouds arranged themselves like notes on a staff, the ground held a weight that invited certain kinds of footsteps and discouraged others. If you stood there with the right kind of memory, you felt it, the possibility held like breath, not gone, not even sleeping, waiting, the way an instrument waits in its case while the room fills with guests, and one of them, surely, will sing. The tower stood, skeletal and proud, a crown of copper on a wooden body, half built but fully alive. To Nikola Tesla it was a cathedral of resonance. To J.P. Morgan it was a threat. Morgan had been in this game longer than Tesla had been alive. He was not a man of invention, nor of vision. He was a man of ledgers. Where Tesla heard harmony, Morgan heard balance sheets. Where Tesla dreamed of abundance, Morgan dreamed of control. He was a banker, a baron, a collector of other men's futures, and he did not tolerate experiments that could not be owned. At first, Morgan had humored Tesla. The promise of wireless telegraphy was too sweet to ignore. Imagine controlling every whisper across the Atlantic, every coded message of commerce or war, without laying a single cable in the sea. Morgan had smiled when Tesla spoke of it, his heavy-lidded eyes calculating how many governments and shipping companies would line up at his door to pay tribute. Yes, he thought, this eccentric wizard could be useful. But Morgan's smile had limits, and Tesla, in his stubborn brilliance, had crossed them. In the beginning, Tesla had given Morgan what he wanted to hear. He spoke of messages transmitted without wires, of empires knitted together by invisible threads of communication. He avoided the dangerous words, free energy, universal power, in those early meetings. But genius has a way of slipping, of speaking too freely when vision burns too bright, and Tesla, who lived half his life in dreams, could not entirely disguise what he truly sought. Morgan's agents heard him, in lectures and in private, speak of towers not for communication, but for energy itself. Not just signals, but power, light for every home, heat for every hearth, motion for every machine, broadcast into the air, free as sunlight. They carried these whispers back to the banker, and Morgan's smile vanished. The idea offended him, not only as a businessman, but as a monarch of scarcity. Energy was not supposed to be free. It was supposed to be bought and sold, taxed and metered, hoarded and fought over. Without that chain, the world would slip its collar. Without that leash, men like Morgan would be nothing. So the banker turned his gaze on Tesla fully, the way a hawk turns on a mouse that has stepped out of cover. Morgan's influence was not loud. It was not a shout, nor a decree. It was a silence that spread, one door after another closing quietly. Shipments delayed, credit refused, a clerk who once smiled now too busy to take his call. A magazine editor, once eager for an interview, suddenly unsure, suddenly full of apologies. The world began to step back from Tesla, as though from a man marked, and the newspapers sharpened their knives. Cartoons sprouted in ink. Tesla in wizard's robes, Tesla dancing with lightning, Tesla astride a giant mushroom. Columns mocked his accent, his manners, his celibacy, painting him as less than a man, more a curiosity, something to laugh at over breakfast. Editors did not invent this cruelty alone. They were fed it. Whispered suggestions, nudges from Morgan's circle, little payments passed discreetly. The ridicule campaign was not accidental. It was engineered the same way Wardenclyffe had been engineered. But where Tesla sought resonance, Morgan sought dissonance. And Tesla, though he did not admit it aloud, felt the shadow. He felt it in the coil house, where assistants grew nervous and asked if their pay would come. He felt it in the letters that arrived thin as knives, demanding evidence of profit. He felt it in the silence of the public, who had once crowded his demonstrations in awe, but now stayed away, repeating jokes they had read in the papers. But he did not stop. He could not. Because he knew with the certainty of one who listens more deeply than others dare, that Wardenclyffe was not his dream alone. It was memory. It was restoration. When he pressed his hand to the copper dome, he felt Tartaria. He could not speak the word, not in public, not even to his most loyal assistants. But he knew the towers he had seen in visions, the onion domes that had glowed in forgotten cities, the star-shaped fortresses whose geometry was too perfect for defense alone. He knew Wardenclyffe was their child. the first of its kind to rise again, and he knew that was why Morgan moved against him. Not only to protect profit, but to protect silence. For if Wardenclyffe succeeded, it would reveal the lie. It would reveal that energy had once been free, that civilization had once walked in light unchained, and that someone, some force, had chosen to bury it. Morgan's shadow fell over the tower. Funds evaporated, contracts dissolved, workers left, muttering, the dome tarnished in the salt air. But Tesla, walking alone beneath its ribs at night, whispered still. "I remember you," he told it. And the tower, even unfinished, seemed to remember him back. The wind carried salt across the Long Island fields, rattling through the half-finished ribs of the tower. The workers had gone. The hammer songs had ended. What remained was a skeleton of wood and copper rising over the weeds, creaking like an old ship at anchor. Wardenclyffe was quiet now. Too quiet. But silence, Tesla knew, is never empty. He came often still, walking the perimeter with the slow gravity of a priest entering a desecrated church. His coat flapped against his thin frame, his shoes crunching on gravel that had not been swept in months. Where once men shouted measurements and cursed bent nails, only the gulls called now, their voices sharp against the sky. The tower loomed over him, abandoned but not dead, a body whose heart still beat faintly, though no one cared to listen. Tesla listened. He placed his palm on the timber, leaning in as though against a living friend. The grain was cold, but beneath it, yes, there. A faint vibration, a ghost of resonance. It had not forgotten. Even without power, even half-built, the tower still remembered what it was meant to be. Like a violin resting in its case, it hummed to itself, inaudible to most, but not to him, never to him. The newspapers said it was finished, a folly never to be completed. They laughed about the eccentric wizard, ruined by dreams too large. Children played nearby, daring one another to touch the fence and run, squealing as if chased by spirits. Farmers pointed to the dome and spat, saying their horses shied at it, their cows milked poorly under its shadow. The world had already written Wardenclyffe into myth, a cautionary tale about hubris. But Tesla walked the site like a man visiting a grave where the body had not yet cooled. He spoke softly to the beams, to the earth, to the dome above. "I hear you," he murmured, "even if they do not." And perhaps, in the creak of wood, in the shifting of air, something answered. Inside the coil house, dust gathered on copper. The assistants were gone, sent home, dismissed, scattered by fear and by unpaid wages. Tesla sat alone at the workbench, turning the pages of his notebooks with fingers that trembled from more than age, spiral after spiral, circuit after circuit. His handwriting had grown erratic, urgent. In the margins he wrote fragments that no financier would understand. It remembers. They erased it once. They erase it again. The earth hums still. He knew what he had touched at Wardenclyffe. It was not fantasy. It was not madness. It was proof. Proof that power flowed freely in the world, waiting only to be tuned. Proof that Tartaria had not been myth, but mastery. The towers, the domes, the cathedrals, they had been instruments, machines of resonance. The ancients had known what he had rediscovered, and now, once more, that knowledge was being buried. The silence pressed harder. Doors closed to him in the city. Banks turned cold. Former allies avoided his gaze. The ridicule in the papers grew crueler, stripping him of dignity, reducing him to caricature. The Wizard of Wardenclyffe, the mad inventor, they painted him not as a man of science but as a curiosity, a freak. Tesla felt it keenly. Reputation had been his currency, and it was spent now. He walked New York streets like a ghost, people glancing and looking away, whispering of his oddities. Once he had drawn crowds in awe, now he was a punchline. But he carried Wardenclyffe within him still. At night, in his rented room, he closed his eyes and felt again the vibration beneath his palm, the tower's faint hum. He dreamed of cities lit without wires, of streets warmed without smoke, of fountains dancing to frequencies in the air. He dreamed of Tartaria, not as ruins, not as rumor, but alive again, reborn in copper and timber. He woke with tears on his face, not of despair, but of certainty. He had seen what the world might have been. Silence is not absence, it is suppression. Tesla knew this. He saw it now in his own life as clearly as in history. Tartaria had been silenced once before, erased from maps, buried under mud and ridicule. Now it was his turn. The pattern repeated: build, reveal, threaten the lie, and be silenced. Wardenclyffe stood as a monument to that pattern. Not failure, but fear. It had not been destroyed because it could not work. It had been abandoned because it could. Because if it lived, it would have undone the empire of scarcity, and scarcity was the throne upon which Morgan and men like him sat. So the tower waited in silence, patient as stone. And Tesla, walking alone in its shadow, whispered his vow: "You will not be forgotten." The end, when it came, was not fire and ruin, but the soft closing of a door. It was January 1943, and New York was locked in winter. The city's avenues were muffled by snow, its noise softened, its frenzy slowed. In a modest hotel room at the New Yorker, Nikola Tesla lay still, his body frail, his breath shallow. For years he had been a ghost, moving through lobbies and park benches, feeding pigeons, carrying scraps of bread in his pockets, while the world hurried past him. But when he died, the silence that followed was anything but ordinary. Within hours, men in dark suits appeared at the door. They carried no grief, only authority. They did not weep. They carried boxes. The hotel manager, nervous, wrung his hands as they passed. "Is it necessary?" he asked. One of the men glanced at him, eyes flat. "National security." 2 words sharp enough to cut off all protest. The manager stepped aside, ashamed of his curiosity, ashamed of his fear. Inside Tesla's room, the agents moved quickly. Trunks were opened, drawers emptied, notebooks thick with sketches and strange calculations were stacked in neat piles. Bundles of letters, half-finished essays, scraps of diagrams, everything was gathered. The boxes filled, then filled again. When they left, Tesla's room was bare. The curtains stirred in the draught, the bed neatly made, as though no genius had ever lived there. The papers were gone. What was taken that night? The official story was simple. Tesla's notes contained sensitive information, possible designs for weapons, technologies that could not be allowed to fall into the wrong hands during wartime. The United States was deep in World War II, after all. Security demanded precaution, but silence lingered. For not all of those papers were ever returned. Some vanished into archives, others, it is whispered, into private vaults. And the question remains, what was hidden among them? Tesla's mind had never rested. Even in his last years, when the world thought him irrelevant, he filled notebooks with visions, machines that harvested energy from the air, diagrams of coils that could light cities without wires, sketches of towers that mirrored Wardenclyffe. His handwriting shook, but his ideas did not. Among the papers, some say, were designs not of invention but of memory, devices that resonated with the earth itself, instruments that could make the planet sing. In other words, Tartarian technology. It is tempting to dismiss this as myth, to say the papers contained only the fantasies of an aging man. But why then the secrecy? Why the urgency with which they were seized? Why the decades of silence that followed? The truth is buried, as Tartaria was buried. Consider, if Tesla's notes had proven impossible, impractical, the authorities could have released them, dismissing them as the ramblings of a dreamer. But they did not. They locked them away. They classified them. They made them vanish. Suppression does not fall upon emptiness. Suppression falls upon threat. The lost papers became legend. Researchers chased rumors, scraps, whispers. Families of Tesla's assistants recalled fragments of conversations, machines that healed through frequency, towers that harvested resonance, cities alive with energy shared by all. Each fragment pointed not to fantasy but to continuity. Continuity with something older, something forgotten. Tesla himself had hinted at it in his scattered writings. He spoke of the earth as a conductor, of energy flowing through soil and sky like blood through veins. He described resonance as the key to unlocking abundance. He spoke, always obliquely, of towers that had once dotted the world, whose shapes mirrored his own designs. He never named Tartaria. He did not need to. The silence around it spoke louder than words. Imagine opening those trunks that night in the New Yorker hotel. Imagine unfolding the notebooks, seeing not random sketches but a system, a map of energy hidden in the very skin of the world. Imagine finding not invention but rediscovery, the evidence that Tesla had touched the same truth once known by a civilization erased. Would you let the world see it, or would you bury it again? The silence of those missing papers is deafening. They are the echo of Wardenclyffe, the echo of Tartaria, the echo of a truth that threatens the foundation of scarcity. Tesla's body lay cold in that hotel room, but his ideas did not die. They were carried away in boxes, sealed in silence, hidden where no light could reach, and perhaps, somewhere still, those pages wait. Pages filled with spirals and frequencies, with towers and domes, with the hum of a memory too dangerous to speak. Pages that, if read, would confess the truth. That Nikola Tesla was not the mad dreamer they painted him to be, but the last heir of a forgotten empire. After the men with boxes left the hotel room, after the door clicked shut, and the corridor swallowed their footsteps, a new story began. Quietly, under breath, the way seeds begin a forest. It was not a story of headlines or courtrooms. It did not belong to men who write ledgers. It moved in other hands. For a time, New York behaved as though nothing had happened. Winter laid down another skin of grey on the avenues. Pigeons took their indifferent steps. The radio spoke of troop movements and production quotas, and boys who would not be coming home. Somewhere in a federal building, a clerk affixed the word classified to what he did not understand, and would never be allowed to. He went home that night and kissed his daughter's hair, and thought of nothing unusual. History often shifts inside rooms, where no one present will ever admit to feeling the floor tilt. But those notebooks, those sketches, those letters that smelled of varnish and metal, everything that slid away into the dark, left behind an outline. You can take the shadow off a wall, but you cannot persuade the wall to forget light existed. And in the years that followed, people began to move toward that outline, as if toward the doorway of a house they had once visited in childhood and could find again by smell. It started, as these things generally do, with small salvations. A janitor in a laboratory, who had once delivered a package to Tesla in winter, the kind of man buildings forget while relying on, found an envelope in a bin that should have been burned. He did not read it well. English bent strangely in his mouth, but the drawing inside showed a coil, shaped like a staircase you could climb, without moving your feet. There were notes in a hand both elegant and impatient. He folded the paper, tucked it into his jacket, and never spoke of it. Years later, he would paste that drawing in the back of a cookbook, and his granddaughter, turning pages for dumpling dough, would feel her skin prickle and not know why. In a machine shop on the edge of a river town, where the smoke lay low and the clocks ran true because men made their living keeping them so, a foreman hung a scrap of copper wire above his tool bench like a talisman. The scrap had been cut from a coil house, upstate, years before, a place where a tall man in a bow tie had once stood, with his eyes half closed, listening to the air. The foreman couldn't say what use charm had in a room already crowded with iron and purpose, but when a lathe shivered out of true, he glanced at the copper and adjusted, not the belt, not the oil, but the pace of his own breath. The machine settled. He didn't tell the apprentices what he had done. He told them to sweep. There were letters. Always there are letters. To wives from men who had been assistants, and now were not. He was gentle with the instruments. He never raised his voice. He said thank you to the coils, as if they had given something personal up for him. To brothers from men who worked in utility offices. There was a man, Nikola, Serbian, I think, who tried to give light without wire. We are warned not to say his name in meetings. To sons from fathers whose pride had not thickened into cruelty. Remember, not all failure is failure. Sometimes the world is wrong about the day. There is inheritance through blood, and there is inheritance through attention. The second moves odd ways. A cobbler begins to place brass eyelets in such a way that a boot's tongue speaks more kindly to the foot, because he has begun to suspect metal has manners. A boy in an alley in Thessaloniki rigs a wire between two balconies and whispers to a girl 3 houses down without shouting, and the wire stays up long after the two of them forget why they put it there. A bell in a church tower, cracked in the war, is recast by a man who reads old manuals in a language he cannot pronounce. When it rings, pigeons rise but do not startle, which means the foundry remembered something. In university halls, young men with careful hair and old men with careful doubts argued about ether and fields and what the word free should be allowed to mean. Some of those young men, restless at night, walked out of libraries carrying books under their coats and took streetcars to neighborhoods where light pooled differently. They stood under certain domes and certain cornices and felt the air change weight. They could not put that in a paper. They put it in their hands and later in their instruments, and later still into small devices that hummed in rooms that did not yet have permission to exist. Sometimes the inheritance arrived as a rumor that refused to end. A boy loading sacks in a warehouse in Cleveland heard from a cousin of a man who swore he had touched a globe that lit without wire in a fairground tent. A woman buying buttons at a shop in Krakow heard from the seamstress that her uncle, who worked nights sweeping in a museum, had once followed an old architect to a secret room where models of domes were arranged on a table, and when you sang a certain pitch into the room, the little domes glowed like jars of honey. 3 winters later, the seamstress died, and the shop closed, and the uncle forgot which hall led to the door he could never find again. The rumor remained patient. There were failures that were not quite failures because they called the right enemies. A teacher in Nebraska built a coil in his barn with money saved from not mending the truck, and when it made the radio cough and the cornfield sparkle at dusk, he wrote away for parts to a man in Chicago whose catalogue proudly said, "No questions." 2 weeks later, men with hats and shoes that did not admit dust visited and asked questions anyway. The barn burned down before spring. The insurance man was sympathetic. He said lightning on a form and shook his head, smiling. The teacher bought a new truck. He kept a piece of the coil under the seat, and it made a small whine sometimes when the wind blew from the north. He did not tell anyone that the truck started easier on those days. In another city, a dentist with nimble fingers the kind of man who understands force in ounces, collected radio parts the way his neighbors collected stamps. He grew adept at finding the precise location in his apartment where an antenna brought in a voice speaking Turkish at 2 a.m. and another speaking English through a tunnel at 3:15. He built a loop that, on humid nights, made the ceiling sweat more than it should and the sweet gum tree outside shrug off ants for a week. He could not publish this either. He kept a notebook in which he wrote phrases like, "The room wants to sing lower when it rains," and "Bell in church 2 streets over seems to quiet the hiss," and NT was right about kindness as a measure of field. A widow in Queens found, in a chest she had been afraid to open since the year her husband died, a sheaf of papers bound with thread. On the first page a neat hand had written, "Resonance Experiments, 1907 to 1912. On the second page, the hand turned fevered and diagonal, as if it had begun to race the kind of clock the wall cannot show. Drawings of coils, drawings of towers, domes with notes in the margins. Not pretty, useful, and curves take care of feet. She tried to read and could not. She took the papers to a pawn shop where a man with gold rings dithered, offered a sum, then changed his mind. She took them home again. She wrapped them in a towel and put them behind the winter sheets. When she moved 10 years later, her son threw the towel and the papers away together. The truck that collected the trash that morning hummed oddly as it turned on Northern Boulevard. You cannot fence an inheritance when the inheritance is a way of noticing. It fell to ground and took root wherever anyone had patience to keep their ear to wood or water. In Italy, a mason discovered that a stairwell built to a ratio he could not justify made quarrels on the second floor shorter than quarrels on the third. In India, a station master adjusted the angle of a corrugated roof, and the waiting room became bearable in late May. In Japan, a carpenter, hired to restore a tea house that war had shaken, found in the attic a bell so thin you could see your breath bend through it. He hung it, and discovered that the house's ghosts, if ghosts is what they were, withdrew to the corners and left the doorways alone. None of these people knew a man named Tesla. They knew the pleasure of a problem easing under a hand that stops pushing and starts listening. There are also men who collect not to protect, but to keep. They have vaults that hum a little, because paper hums when you stack it long enough, in the presence of truths that want to be air. They bought patents cheap from men with sick children. They bought laboratories 1 month behind the rent and turned them into storerooms for art, then storerooms for art into rooms with no listings. They bought silence by the year from lovers, from journalists, from ministers who found themselves unable to reconcile certain verses. They bound the world with signatures and used that binding to teach themselves that structure and health are the same word. Their mistake was not wickedness. It was fear practiced daily until it felt like diligence. And yet, the hidden inheritance could not be contained by paper and locks, because it was older than both. It remembered brass and stone, and domes that glowed and towers that made men sleep easier in summer. It remembered star-shaped forts that were not ornaments, but listening posts, and bell towers that were not only clocks but lungs. It remembered a calendar that put harvest where pressure allowed and rest where the sky demanded, a curriculum not printed, but rung. It remembered, in short, Tartaria, not as a flag nor a border, but as a method. In the 1950s, a boy in a desert west of everything lay on the roof of his parents' house and felt the sky press down like a warm hand. His father, who welded irrigation pipe, snored in a chair below. The boy had a kit, a crystal radio with a cat's whisker and a coil he had wound too loosely. He tuned and could not find a station because the station he wanted did not exist yet. What he found was a hum, patient and enormous, like a very large animal sleeping on the other side of a wall. Years later, he would become the kind of engineer who keeps a plant on his desk and waters it without a schedule, and when a substation failed that should not have, He would ask for the maintenance log, not for the wires, but for the bell in the town square a mile away. They laughed. He replaced nothing, changed nothing, and asked the mayor to ring the bell again at noon, because a celebration was happening, and why had the town stopped? The mayor did it because the newspaper wanted a picture. The substation's trouble abated. The engineer did not say "I told you so." He sent a donation to the care of the bell. In the 1960s, a woman in Prague who tuned pianos between teaching lessons began to notice that certain rooms refused certain keys. She took notes on ruled paper, then on walls when the paper ran out, then in the margins of a cookbook, like a grandmother who hides money where thieves do not think to look. She found that when she left a piano slightly off at a particular interval, the people who practiced in that room looked up more often, opened windows more often, quarreled less with girlfriends. She was asked to tune a hall for a minister who wanted clarity for speeches. She tuned it for mercy instead. He wept at the podium and called it grace. She called it C sharp. In the 1970s, a man with a van and a workshop in the back drove from county to county in the American South, fixing radios and televisions for people who paid him in cash and sometimes in chickens. He had a face that smiled easily, and a mind that did not let go easily. In a farmhouse whose paint remembered different weather, he repaired a set that died every afternoon at 3. He replaced the tube. It died again. He rerouted the antenna. It died again. He sat on the porch steps after the second coffee and listened to the wind. On the hour, a church bell, far and far, climbed the hill. At 3 it did not ring. He walked to the church, found a rope frayed to threads, cut a new length from his stock, and tied a knot he had been taught by a sailor who had never had a boat. The bell rang at 3. The television remembered how to speak. The owner tried to pay him with a ham and small apology. He took the ham. He took the apology. He drove away with the window down. The inheritance travelled inside such repairs, inside such refusals to accept that explanation and truth are the same thing. And sometimes it travelled in obvious clothes. A group of amateurs in a Midwestern city built a coil taller than a man and invited the curious to watch it throw blue veils across the dark. They did not know that the shape they had built had a precedent in a tower by the sea that had been torn down by men who prefer not to sleep near certain kinds of possibility. They knew only the joy in a child's face when the child felt the air become an instrument. From time to time, someone tried to sell the inheritance. A pamphlet with a lens flare on the cover promised energy from air, no utility bills ever. A man in a suit who had rented his conscience by the hour showed a device on a stage and gestured like a magician and used the correct words with the incorrect cadence. The device did not work outside the stage lights. This too became part of the inheritance, not the fraud, but the caution that a method is not a product and will revolt when you try to turn it into one. There were also darker rooms, laboratories in which earnest men with hangdog eyes built weapons because they had been told that was the price of being allowed to build anything at all. Some of them, by accident, found frequencies at which flesh behaves like a story told to it in the wrong voice. They wrote reports with words like non-lethal and crowd control, and sometimes they even believed those words meant less harm than they spelled. In those rooms, the inheritance grew thin, the way a plant grows thin behind glass. But it did not die. Plants are patient. Methods are more so. An architect in Buenos Aires, with a spine like a metronome, designed a building that made people late less often. He put the stair where it wanted to be, according to a conversation he had with the wind at the site long before the investor signed. He wrote Venturi on a napkin in a cafe, and then, alone, wrote beneath it Bell. His partner teased him and stole the napkin to draw a moustache on the V. Years later, After a coup and a recession and a divorce that did not hurt anyone enough to be called tragedy, people still met easily in that building and forgave one another more quickly in the hallway on the 4th floor. A teacher in Kyoto asked his students to hum before they began class. He did not ask them to make music. He asked them to make a room. He taught mathematics and was not ashamed of poise or of the way a proof will sit down if the chair is pulled out from under it. On the day a boy's father did not come home, the teacher hummed a different note and drew a circle that was not a circle on the board, and the boy wept and then finished the problem without wiping his eyes. He did not know he had inherited anything. He knew only that the room held. In the 1990s, a graduate student in a coastal engineering program found herself writing a thesis that embarrassed her advisor because it spoke about breakwaters as if they were not obstacles but instruments. She argued for curves that matched the sea's patience instead of walls that challenged its strength. She was told to cite more men who had already been cited. She revised and added a chapter with equations so correct they were almost cruel. The curves were built. The harbor calmed. Fishermen, who had never read a paper in their lives, told one another that the sea sounded happier. The student took a job designing parks. She hummed when she worked. Once, a man in Zurich, bald, elegant, successful in the way that is a temperature more than a resume, opened a safe and looked upon papers he had bought with money that had not been hard for him to find. He read a page written in a hand that leaned forward as if late. He read a paragraph that spoke of towers and resonance, and something the writer had called the remembered field. He felt very briefly the urge to let the papers go in a way that could not be traced back to him, and could not be prosecuted by a law written by men who have never been able to feel a room. He closed the safe. He went upstairs and drank something old and expensive, and tasted nothing. The next day he tried to buy a church, and always, in the background, a low sound. The hum the boy in the desert had heard on his roof. The hum the janitor's granddaughter almost recognized when she rolled dough. The hum in the stairwell that denied quarrels their full appetite. It grew louder where men and women decided to keep their windows the size their elders had discovered, by standing near them in summer and listening to their own foreheads. It retreated where men who like to put their names on things put their names on things. It returned when, in a city that had forgotten what bells are for, a baker pulled a tray from an oven and opened his door to let the street smell like mercy for a minute. The hidden inheritance is not a map to buried towers or a manual with steps numbered. It is a posture. It is a tolerance for slowness, when slowness is the only instrument that will tune. It is the courage to admit that a room can be wrong, and that the room, not the people in it, should be changed first. It is the gentleness to touch copper as if it had waited for you personally. It is the impudence to hang a coil in a barn, and the humility to know that if the cornfield sparkles, you must check first whether the church bell has ceased to ring. And somewhere underneath it all, a line that runs from a field on Long Island, back through a hotel room, to a trunk full of papers, and then back further still, through domes and star forts and minarets and courtyards, where water learned to listen. A civilization is not a thing that dies. It is a way of doing attention that goes to ground during drought, and then, when one person hums the right note in a kitchen, or a lab or a stairwell, lifts its head. Tesla did not intend to leave a cult. He left a method. He did not bequeath a faith. He bequeathed a tone. The men who took his papers bequeathed a different thing, an emptiness with the shape of a confession. The emptiness travels more slowly than the tone but cannot defeat it, because a tone need not be believed to be true. It only needs to be heard. The hidden inheritance moves on. It arrives tonight in the hands that straighten a picture in a hallway so that the hallway stops insisting on sadness. It arrives When a nurse tilts a blind just enough to let in the light, a dying man needs to remember the color of a lake he once loved. It arrives when a commuter stands on a platform and notices that the particular pitch of the train's brakes makes all the children scowl and decides, without being asked, to write a letter to a man who will never answer it, and then goes to the depot anyway, to hum into a bad room and ask it, politely, to stop biting. You cannot make a law against this. You can seize papers, you can close towers, you can mock a man until breakfast tastes better for it. But there are hands in every town that have learned, without schooling, that a screw turned until it sings is a screw that will not betray you. That a block placed where the wind says put, it will warm a room longer than a block placed where a blueprint insists. That a bell rung at the right time makes the day smaller or larger as needed. Those hands are the archive. Not the vault, not the safe, not the men who place their names into stone and then go home deaf to their wives' headaches. The last light leaves the workshop. The coil cools. A moth settles on the varnish as if it recognized a tree in it and decided to sleep close to its remembered sap. Down the alley, a woman flips a sign to closed and exhales while the air in the shop, 20 feet away, seems to sigh with her. A very small accord that none of her customers would pay for, but every one of them would miss if it left. This is the inheritance, the world made slightly more itself, by people who have been taught, by stories and failures, and a tower that rose like a memory, that power is not ownership, but the art of easing difference, that the planet is alive and willing to be played by those who learned from a man who listened before he spoke, that Tartaria is not only a map word, but a way a city can decide to treat its air, that Tesla did not die alone so much as he passed his part to a chorus that has always been rehearsing without permission. The hum continues. The night Tesla first sketched Wardenclyffe in his notebook, the lines did not come from imagination alone. They came, as all his visions did, from something deeper, something half-remembered. His pen moved in spirals, his lines thickened into domes and spires, and what emerged looked less like the future than like a memory resurfacing. He paused and stared at the page, the candle flickering beside him, the shapes he had drawn, tall spires capped with copper crowns, onion domes swollen with silent energy, reminded him of pictures he had seen in old books of Moscow, Samarkand, Istanbul. He had dismissed them once as decoration, as the gaudy play of architects gone mad with ornament. But tonight, alone in his room, he saw them differently. They were not decorative, they were functional, machines disguised as temples, instruments disguised as cathedrals, and if he looked at them this way, history itself bent and cracked. Tesla had walked the streets of Europe in his youth, staring up at cathedrals, whose domes caught the sun like bowls of fire. He remembered the star-shaped forts scattered across the continent, their strange geometry too precise for defense alone. Why, he had wondered then, did these shapes appear again and again, across nations, across centuries? Now he knew. They were remnants, fossils of an empire erased. Tartaria. The name, when he first read it, had struck him with the force of recognition. It was as though someone had whispered a word he had been trying to recall for years, a word that had lived on the tip of his tongue in dreams. Tartaria, not a land of myth, but of memory. An empire that had known what he now rediscovered. Energy as free as air, resonance as architecture. Cities alive not with coal and smoke, but with harmony. Imagine the towers as they must have been, rising from the plains, their domes shimmering with copper and gold, their bases sunk into aquifers and stone. Each tower an anchor in a network that stretched across continents, tuned to the pulse of the earth itself. Walk through such a city at night, and you would see no lamps flickering with oil, no chimneys vomiting soot. Instead, Domes glowed softly, fountains shimmered with electric light, the very air hummed with a frequency that soothed rather than poisoned. This was not fantasy. Tesla felt it in his bones. He had glimpsed it in flashes since childhood. Visions of cities too radiant to be medieval, too advanced to be explained away as superstition. He had thought them dreams. Now he realized they were memories. Tartaria had existed, and its towers had once sung. But where were they now? Buried under mud, ruined by flood, toppled by hands determined to erase. The domes remained, stripped of function, reduced to symbols, cathedrals that no longer resonated, minarets robbed of their voice, forts remembered as weapons rather than instruments. The empire had been broken not only in body but in memory. Its science had been relabeled as superstition. Its towers had been reduced to myth. Tesla saw it all clearly, and in Wardenclyffe he sought not invention, but continuation. He was building not the first, but the next. To walk beneath Wardenclyffe at night was to walk among ghosts. Tesla felt them, the resonance of towers long gone, the hum of Tartaria echoing faintly in his dome. He whispered to it sometimes, words no one else could hear. You are not alone. You are of them. You will rise again. And perhaps the tower answered. Perhaps the creak of timber in the salt air was more than wood shifting. Perhaps it was the memory of an empire that refused to die. Tartaria's towers had once promised freedom from scarcity. Wardenclyffe promised the same. And that was why both were silenced. Tesla understood this with bitter clarity. His tower was not destroyed because it could not work. It was destroyed because it could. Just as Tartaria had been buried, so too would Wardenclyffe be dismantled, mocked, erased. The pattern was the same. The lie was the same. But the memory lingered. In stone, in domes, in Tesla himself. And memory, once awakened, does not easily sleep again. The destruction of a tower is an event. The destruction of memory is a policy. Wardenclyffe had been dismantled plank by plank, its copper dome torn down and sold as scrap. That was visible. People could drive past the empty field and say, "There once stood the madman's tower." They could laugh, they could point, they could spit. The ruin was tangible. But memory could not be left even that. The true silencing did not happen on Long Island's shore. It happened in schools, in newspapers, in textbooks, in the slow drip of ridicule, and the carefully engineered forgetting that followed. Tesla became not the inheritor of Tartaria, not the man who nearly set the world free, but a caricature, a wizard, an eccentric, a recluse who fed pigeons. And just like that, the pattern repeated. When Tartaria fell, it did not fall in a single night of fire. It fell through mud and omission, through histories rewritten by victors, through maps redrawn with lines that erased whole continents of memory. The towers became churches, the star forts became curiosities, the domes became ornament. The empire was not conquered in battle, but buried in silence. Tesla saw it. He felt it in his own bones as his reputation unraveled. The laughter in the papers was the same as the silence in history books. The forgetting was the same tool, sharpened again for use. The suppression of memory always works the same way. Reduce the truth to absurdity, make it laughable, then make it invisible. Consider what happened to Tesla's image after his death. The man who had dreamed of powering the world for free was reduced to trivia questions, a footnote under Edison, an eccentric inventor with wild ideas. Schoolchildren learned more of the light bulb than of resonance. They were told Edison won the war of currents, though it was Tesla's alternating current that lit the world. They were told Wardenclyffe was folly, never told why its funding vanished, never told what it might have proven. It was not enough to dismantle the tower. They had to dismantle the man, and so his image was rewritten until the inheritance could not be recognized. But memory, Tesla knew, has its own ways of surviving. It lives in architecture, in the silent domes that still dot skylines, in the geometry of old plazas, aligned not to armies, but to resonance. It lives in the faint hum of Wardenclyffe's beams, long after the dome was gone. It lives in the dreams of children who look at stormlight and see patterns too familiar to be invention. The suppression was thorough, but it was never complete. Memory is stubborn. It seeps through cracks. Tesla had seen it with Tartaria, and in his final years he whispered it to himself. They erased it once. They erase it again. He did not despair. He knew that what is erased can also be remembered if enough ears are willing to listen. The suppression of memory is never only about the past. It is about control of the present. If the world could forget Tartaria, it could accept smoke and soot as progress. If the world could forget Tesla, it could accept wires, bills, and scarcity as reality. That was the true work of suppression. Not only to bury history, but to chain possibility. And yet, silence hums. Even now, if you stand in the ruins of forgotten forts, or beneath domes whose curves seem too perfect for mere faith, or in the empty field where Wardenclyffe once stood, you can feel it. The hum, the memory, the refusal to be forgotten. Tesla's tower was gone, his papers scattered, his name bent into myth. But memory, suppressed, mocked, buried, remained, waiting, not gone, never gone, waiting to rise again. The official story is tidy. A frail old man, 86 years of age, dies alone in a hotel room on a cold January night. A heart finally exhausted, a body that had carried too much brilliance too long. The newspapers printed it in small columns. Nikola Tesla, eccentric inventor, dead in New York hotel. Nothing more. But tidy stories are often written to hide untidy truths. For Tesla's death was not only the end of a life, it was the completion of a campaign that had begun the day he first whispered that energy could be free. The New Yorker hotel was a hive of strangers. Hundreds of rooms, thousands of footsteps, bellboys carrying suitcases, maids pushing carts down long, echoing halls. In such a place, the death of a solitary man could be overlooked, dismissed as unremarkable. Yet within hours of Tesla's passing, government agents were at his door. They arrived too quickly, too efficiently, with too much certainty. They knew. Why such urgency? Why such immediate seizure of his belongings? Why was his room stripped bare before his body had even cooled? The answer lies not in what Tesla had just done, but in what he was still capable of doing. Tesla was old, yes. He was penniless, mocked, forgotten by most. But his mind had not stopped. In the final years of his life, he filled notebooks with sketches and formulas. He spoke in fragments to the few who would still listen, of towers that could pull energy from the air, of frequencies that could heal, of resonance that could change the fate of nations. And in those same years, he had grown less cautious about what he hinted. He spoke more openly of architecture, of towers and domes, whose design was no accident. He remarked once to a young engineer who visited him, "We have lived in this harmony before. Long ago, the towers stood then as they should stand now." The boy did not understand, but he remembered. Tesla was speaking of Tartaria. The danger was not that Tesla might build another Wardenclyffe. The danger was that he might talk, clearly, boldly, without disguise. That he might, in his final years, decide he had nothing left to lose and confess what he knew. That his inventions were not inventions at all, but rediscoveries. that the great erased empire had mastered free energy long before him, that the ruins still whispered if one knew how to listen. If Tesla had stood before a microphone or published a single book laying out this truth, the silence surrounding Tartaria would have cracked. The ridicule that had protected the lie for so long might not have held, and in that crack, light would have poured. That could not be allowed, and so the decision was made. Quiet, efficient, without signatures or witnesses. Tesla would not be permitted to speak further. No poison in the glass. No dramatic end. Something subtler. A silence engineered as carefully as any of his machines. He had lived in fragile health for decades, his body weakened by obsession, his diet peculiar, his sleep irregular. To nudge such a body into stillness required no spectacle, a visit, a hand adjusting a dose, a man slipping in at night under the pretext of kindness. The record would read natural death, and no one would look closer. And so it did. But the speed with which the agents arrived betrays the truth. They were waiting. They had expected it. Perhaps they had even arranged it. The death was not surprise, but opportunity. Within hours, Tesla's trunks and papers vanished. Officially, to protect national security. In reality, to lock away the evidence of a continuity too dangerous to acknowledge. The lost notebooks, those pages of spirals, towers, frequencies, were not locked away because they were nonsense. They were locked away because they were not. Among them, perhaps, were the blueprints that connected Wardenclyffe to Tartaria's towers. Perhaps there were notes where Tesla wrote plainly what he had only ever hinted, that the domes of old were instruments, that resonance had been mastered before, that free energy was not his genius, but humanity's inheritance. If such pages were released, the story of history itself would shatter. Tesla's death, then, was not the end of a recluse. It was the silencing of a witness. They could dismantle Wardenclyffe, they could ridicule his name, they could seize his papers, but so long as Tesla lived, he could still speak. He could still, at any moment, decide to lay the secret bare. That risk was intolerable, and so the last silence fell. Yet even in death, Tesla escaped them. For silence, as he had always known, is never empty. His life's work hummed in the air, in domes and towers that still stood as fossils of a forgotten age. His memory seeded rumors, dreams, inheritances carried in notebooks, hidden in drawers, in coils built in barns, in the hum of a child's radio. They silenced the man, they buried his papers, but the resonance could not be killed, because resonance, like memory, returns. And so the truth they feared, that Tesla was the last heir of Tartaria, and that his death was engineered to keep that truth from reaching the public, still hums, waiting for ears willing to hear. Morning opens like a soft door. In a city that could have been ours, the lamps dim themselves to a kindness, and the streets breathe a little deeper, as if relieved that night has returned all its burdens without breaking. No sirens rush to insist on drama. There is no need. The grid is not a whip here, but a listening. The towers, cousins of the one that once tried to rise on Long Island, keep vigil above rooftops with domes the color of warm copper. They are quiet, but not silent, and their quiet is the sort that reminds the body how to rest. A woman named Mara rises before the first bell. She is not rushing to catch a bus. The trains won't leave without the neighborhood's pulse. She stands on her balcony and feels the faint hum in the rail beneath her palm. It is saying rain by afternoon. A slower market. A good day for the herb stalls to take the shade. She pads into a kitchen with a window set, at the height that the masons here have used for 100 years to make mornings the color of milk. The kettle does not hiss. It warms the way a small animal wakes. Down on the corner, a baker pulls the door open of his shop and lets the street breathe his first tray of loaves. The coils under his floor drink from the dome's broadcast, and the room keeps a promise to dough and to wrists. He knows, by the tiniest lift of his own breath when he crosses the threshold, that the tuning has held through the night. He checks anyway, a hand to the brass bracket where the wall tells him, in its own language, that the field is true and the bread will rise on schedule. He sets the tray. He hums without thinking. The bread approves. Across the river, a hospital leaves curtains half drawn and windows cracked the width of a coin because the towers ask for it, and because the elders before them learned that heirs' manners can be guided, but not bullied. Floors are warm without furnaces. Electricity, the old word for the urgent kind of energy, still exists. There are screens in rooms and instruments that complain if you touch them wrong, but here it is part of a larger climate. Nurses do not chart the erratic spikes of machines trying to shout over a room. They chart recovery like a tide that knows which shore to love first. In schools, children practice a kind of listening that has not been taught anywhere else since the old empire went to ground. At the start of class, they lay their hands on the tops of their tables and learn the room's note. They do not call this science, though it is. They do not call it art, though it is that too. They call it setting, the way you set dough or a table or an intention. Teachers who remember winters when the towers slept teach the children how to notice before they calculate. The calculations come easily after. If Tesla had lived long enough to name this city, he would not have chosen a word that belongs to men who make maps. He would have called it an instrument. He would have said, "We are tuning ourselves back to what the planet has always offered. We are returning to the grammar of resonance that our grandparents were told was only decoration." And then he would have smiled shyly and asked if the baker's mother's headaches had improved. He did not live to say it, but the sentence is there just the same, written in bricks and domes and train timings and the way the lamps refuse to glare. The towers here are not monuments. They are fountains that no one can empty. Their roots sink into aquifers and bedrock. Their crowns sip sky, and between those two intimacies, they hold a conversation that gives without becoming poorer. The word free was misused for a long time in our other world. It became a synonym for cheap, for careless, for what is owed to no one. Here it means something else. It means belonging. It means abundance, disciplined by manners. The towers broadcast power the way trees broadcast shade. If you step under, you agree to the rules of shade. You may bring a chair. You may not bring a fire. At noon, the market opens its awnings like sails and lowers them again as the first bell advises. Rain has kept its promise. There are no generators because there is no panic. The stalls do not blink out when a wire fails, because there are no wires. The field thickens under canvas. Fish keep cold in a gentle pocket of air without ice. A child with a lemon drink watches drop speed and then run. She follows them with a finger and discovers, without any adult needing to coax it into a lesson, that water prefers curves, and that to force it otherwise is rude and costly. The trains glide in lines that remember the old star forts, because the forts were never only for war. The platforms hum the chord of their district, each with a different third, so that a person stepping from one neighborhood to the next can feel, in the bones that carry less truth than they admit, that they have entered another obligation. The obligation is simple: be on time to your neighbors and late to your fears. The trains keep this better than people can. They leave when the market's threshold is met, when the street's breath says now, not when a clock drawn by men who never carried baskets says must. In this world, empires learn to stay home, not because they are less proud, but because the sea and sky have ways of training pride when power has stopped pretending it is scarcity. There is no war for oil because the word oil belongs to kitchens and to stories about ships and to the sheen on a grandfather's boots. there is still cruelty. There are still men who look at a field and think mine. But when they reach to take, their hands meet the resistance of neighbors who have energy without needing to be sold it, who have food because the water remembers how to make the air less thirsty, who do not leave because leaving is no longer the only cure. Factories have chimneys in this world, but the chimneys are for telling weather, not for making it worse. They stand slender and proud like minarets and ring with bells that carry not sermons but schedules. When the turbines in the floor will ask for less, when the cooling pools will give back to the river, when a group of apprentices will present their new coil to the council, and everyone is invited to eat. Smoke rises sometimes, because nothing is perfect. But when it does, it smells like wood and apology. The smell does not last. There is money here, but it has learned to be shy. Power refuses to be sold, and as a result, greed has had to move to smaller rooms, where it cannot ruin so many. Banks lend to repairs first. They do it not because they are saints, but because the charters of the towers say, those who keep the hum smooth will always be paid in safety. There are still men with too many shirts. They are still tempted to collect staircases the way children collect shells. They are managed the way storms are managed, by redirecting, by building better drains, by ringing bells that remind a street who it wants to be. Hospitals have gardens, not on roofs only, but in courtyards, where geometry becomes mercy. Long wards do not echo, because the field in a long room can make a fever remember it is time to break. Nurses walk in shoes that do not stab floors. People die here as they must everywhere, but they do it in rooms that kept listening to the end. The last sound is not a monitor's hunger. It is a bell hiding in the sound of rain. On a hill above the city, a school for engineers keeps its windows open, even in winter. Students carry coils under their arms, the way poets once carried notebooks. They do not speak of disruption. They speak of tuning. They do not talk about moving fast and breaking things, because they have been taught that everything already belongs to someone's breathing. Their first exam is to sit in a bare room and say when the room wants a window and where. The wrong answer is an argument. The right answer is a door. Politics has grown boring, which is the long word for trustworthy. Councils are chosen by lot among those who have done their public chores well. Repairers, teachers, nurses, bakers who can prove they have delivered bread to a neighbor's door on a day they did not profit by it. Speeches are short because rooms that are tuned refuse to carry pontification. It dies in the rafters. The bells remember the lies of last season and will not ring for those who told them. We call that superstition in the other world. Here it is called memory and is written down only in the way corners are curved. A man named Alim, whose father came from a dry place where wind is a teacher and water an uncle you only see on holidays, runs a bathhouse near the university. The baths are municipal, which is a sacral word disguised as administrative. They are free in the old sense. They belong to everyone and to no one. Steam rises, but not in punishment. The rooms are tuned to ease argument and court confession without forcing it. Students come here to learn to listen to their own hearts the way they have learned to listen to magnets and clouds. They leave less lonely. The baths do what books sometimes cannot. At dusk, festivals begin without schedules. Lanterns lift on streets that have learned how to hold them without begging for power. A girl named Thea runs with a sparkler in her hand and discovers that when she stands under the tower's lip, the sparkler's stream shortens and thickens like a ribbon taught to behave. She does not know she is participating in a lesson 3 empires tried to erase. She knows only that the air has manners here, and that her mother laughs softer than on other streets. Away from the city, far up a valley, where the river takes its time, and the grass is not in a hurry to be called by any name, a village has a low dome that looks like a yawn. It does not broadcast power all day. It does not need to. At night, in winter, when the wind insists, the dome lifts its note. Windows forget to cry with frost. Old men sleep without declaring war on their knees. The dome is not a miracle. It is a courtesy engineered from memory. Copper doing what copper wants to do if you do not bully it. Water doing what water wants to do if you stop talking long enough to hear it answer. Ports have changed most visibly. Ships dock with the ease of geese finding a pond. Cranes move with grace that would shame a dancer. The water's surface remains unbroken by the tantrums of engines, because the harbour is tuned for that too, and because the city has the decency to ask the sea what it can bear before throwing metal at it. Oil is a taste here, the sweetness on an olive, the glint on wood, not a demand. Tankers are museum pieces children climb on to learn the old ways men used to frighten themselves. Night falls, the towers shift to their watch notes. The lamps lift their bodies like little animals preparing for sleep. There are screens in windows because curiosity is not a sin and pictures carry kindness when used correctly. There are still rumors because humans have kept that other inheritance as well. But the rumors do not eat their hosts because the rooms are tuned against cruelty. You can tell, walking past a cafe, when the talk has turned mean. The bell in the place rings once, not loudly, and nobody knows why they suddenly want to ask about someone's grandmother. Meanness cannot breathe where people remember their dead with bread. The world beyond the city is not perfect either. There are still borders, but they behave more like watersheds. Trains know when to bow. Agreements are made in halls with domes that glow faintly, not because men wish to feel holy, but because the rooms are shaped to hold the sort of courage that tells a minister he is wrong in time to save a river. War has not vanished. War has lost the argument most days. The argument is not moral, but practical. Abundance is the better bribe. When energy refuses to be fenced, pride has to find smaller jobs. If you climb the tower stairs, there are stairs and they are not grand, you will find the metal remembers hands. Each step gives back a small assurance. On the platform, air is thicker by a kindness. You will not freeze in winter or burn in summer if the keepers have done their work. You look out, and the city looks back. Not in vanity, but in recognition. Its lines and circles, its curves and corners, the way it breathes, the way it refuses to shout. You see the places where the old empire's instruments were discovered under churches and monuments and ordinary squares. You see how the new domes grew from those fossils as easily as a seed finds the memory of a forest in dirt that has been paved for a century. You understand then, even if no one says it aloud, that what Tesla sought was not an empire of his own, but a return to the good manners of power. He was not an inventor in this story, as much as he was an heir who refused to squander the family's last silver. He held a fork the right way and reminded the table that knives are not for pointing. He built one tower. In this world, the tower did not fall. It multiplied, but quietly, the way a habit does, and the habit became a culture, and the culture became weather. Mara, the woman who woke with her hand on the balcony rail, goes to sleep with the window a finger's width open. The tower shifts its tone once, late, the way a parent checks a child. Somewhere, a train reaches a station and waits an extra breath because rain took longer to leave a street. Somewhere, a bell rings twice and stops an argument before it bends beyond repair. Somewhere, a nurse closes a door with a hand that has learned the weight of mercy. Somewhere, a baker sets a tray for dawn and hums the old note without knowing its age. This is the world that might have been. Not jewels and miracles and the sky pierced by arrogance, but rooms that do not wound, streets that let fatigue step aside, kitchens that remember a winter 3 generations ago and solve it before anyone names it. a world where power is the smallest word for patience, a world where the towers stand because men who once tried to bury their ancestor understood too late that you cannot suffocate a method any more than you can forbid water to remember a riverbed. In such a world, we would have fewer stories about conquest and more about care. We would visit museums to marvel at engines that burn dragons for fuel and shake our heads and go home grateful that our children will never learn the taste of that smoke. We would say softly, at tables long enough to include those who disagree with us, that a city can choose to be kind. And when a child asked how, we would take the child to a hill at dusk and let the tower answer. We would say, listen, and the child would, and the air would too. And between those two listenings, a civilization would remain itself, as if it had never been taught to forget. It begins not with thunder, but with a whisper. A boy in a crowded city leans against a stone wall and hears, faintly, a vibration that no car or machine has made. He asks his grandmother what it is. She tells him to hush. It is only the old church bell shifting in its sleep. But when the boy presses his ear again, he knows it is something more. It is the same hum Tesla felt beneath Wardenclyffe, the same tone that Tartarian towers once broadcast to a whole continent. It has never left. It has only hidden, waiting for ears untrained to doubt. The return of resonance is not a revolution. It is a remembering. It begins when architects start to measure rooms not by square feet, but by the way sound lingers in their corners. When engineers rediscover that copper wants to sing if bent in spirals, that stone hums if laid in stars. When musicians notice that certain domes amplify without microphones, that crowds under onion spires breathe more easily. They say at first that it is accident, a quirk of design. But accidents do not repeat across centuries, across continents. The patterns return. Star forts reveal themselves not as military puzzles, but as tuning forks. Cathedrals reveal themselves not as monuments, but as resonators. Domes whisper again to those who stand beneath them, and in their whisper, a memory rises. We once lived differently. The scholars who study Tesla's scattered notes begin to connect lines. The authorities never wanted joined. They compare his spirals to Tartarian blueprints. They find in his margins the same geometries carved into ancient plazas. They realize that Wardenclyffe was not madness, but memory reawakened. And in this realization, fear begins to break. For once people see that abundance is not fantasy, but continuity, that it has happened before, that it could happen again. They no longer accept the lie of scarcity. They no longer believe the story that soot and wires and bills are the price of civilization. They begin to ask, what if Tesla was right? What if Tartaria was real? What if free energy is not a dream, but an inheritance? These are dangerous questions. Dangerous not because they are false, but because they are true. The return comes slowly, and then all at once. In a workshop in Prague, a young engineer builds a coil that lights a lamp without wires. In a barn in Iowa, a farmer rigs copper spirals into the earth and feels his headaches vanish when he sits beside them. In Delhi, a group of students experiment with domes and discover that their classroom cools without fans. Each thinks they are alone, eccentric, on the fringe. But the stories spread. One by one, the whispers join, until the hum is everywhere. And when enough people listen, the silence can no longer hold. Imagine the world when resonance returns. Cities built not around fuel depots, but around towers of harmony. Homes that hum with gentle energy. No wires snaking across streets, no smoke choking the sky. Hospitals tuned to frequencies that heal. Schools designed not to echo, but to carry calm. Imagine trains gliding not on diesel, but on the pulse of the earth. Ships crossing oceans guided by towers that sing to the sea. Imagine abundance, not as charity, not as commerce, but as air, shared freely because it belongs to all. This is not fantasy. It is memory. It is the world Tartaria once built, the world Tesla nearly restored, the world still waiting to be remembered. And so, the story ends where it began, with a tower. Wardenclyffe was torn down. Its dome was sold as scrap. Its builder died in silence, but the hum remains. The resonance cannot be erased. It is in the stone of forgotten forts, in the domes of cathedrals, in the dreams of children who press their ears to walls. Tesla's last silence was not his end. It was a pause. And now, at the edge of a new century, the hum is returning. Tartaria is remembered. Resonance is returning. And with it, the promise that once nearly lit the world for free. The tower rises again, not of wood and copper this time, but of memory and courage. And when it stands, it will sing. Not invention, not fantasy. Continuation, the inheritance of resonance. The return of Tartaria, the fulfillment of Tesla's vow.